Welcome, my fellow leaders and listeners. This is Succession, a podcast about the pursuit of success, the art of leadership transitions, and the legacies that shape our future. I'm Kori Grillo, and in each episode, we explore what it means to lead with impact, adapt through change, and create a lasting mark on the world of business. Whether you're navigating a career shift or planning your next big move, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into the critical role of executive search in leadership transitions and succession with Ken Schmitt, founder and CEO of Turning Point Executive Search. With nearly 30 years of experience, Ken has built a firm that helps growth-driven companies find top talent in sales, marketing, operations, finance, and the C-suite. We'll explore what makes a leader the right fit, the evolving hiring landscape, and how businesses can secure talent that drives long-term success. Let's get started. Ken, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thanks, Kori. I'm excited about our conversation.
I know, so much going on in your world. But before we jump into all of the new and exciting things, can you give us a little history so we can get a good background for the listeners?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm based here in San Diego, and I've been in the recruiting executive search industry for 28 years now. Quite some time. It's hard to believe it's almost 3 decades, but It's been a while. And I've been on my own for 18 years. So I started Turning Point Executive Search back actually during the financial crisis in 2007.
Whoa, perfect timing.
But my goal had always been to have my own business at some point in my life. I just didn't really know when or what that industry would be like, but I had a chance to start my own way back when in 2007. So it's been a roller coaster ride, but a lot more fun than stress.
Yeah, well, I know how much of a people person you are, but was recruiting and people always at the forefront of what you wanted to do for an entrepreneurial adventure?
Yeah. So people, yes. Recruiting, I really didn't know much about. I mean, we joke all the time in this industry that nobody goes to school to become a recruiter.
Right.
It's
right. I didn't see it on the list of classes to take. No.
Yeah, exactly. So you usually end up doing something else, and then you somehow, some way, you kind of find your way into recruiting.
Right.
And that was my journey as well. I grew up in a self-employed, very entrepreneurial household. My mom was in real estate. My dad was a Jack in the Box franchisee, which if you're not in the western part of the U.S., that's a fast food chain similar to McDonald's or Burger King.
I remember.
So I've been working since age 14 and worked at my dad's stores for quite a while. So I always knew that my personality was more conducive to being in front of people versus being, at a desk behind a computer.
Okay.
But I actually got into recruiting. I just answered an ad in the newspaper back when there were ads in newspapers way back in 1997, a long time ago. And I just fell in love with recruiting. It's just, if you're a lifelong learner, if you're naturally kind of curious about how companies operate, what different leadership styles they are, and just how different industries, succeed, then recruiting is just a very fascinating place to be.
Right. I love that you mentioned lifelong learner. I'm seeing all of these connection points with really successful and positive and joyful leaders and how they kind of develop their careers in these unorthodox ways. But then there's a lot of commonalities in just curiosity and really just enjoying people. It really infuses into the company culture, I think. What do you think?
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I think there's that, it's a kind of a cliche, but it's been around for a long time, as it's the tone at the top.
Yeah.
And whether you're running a team, a department, an organization, or you're just a 1 or 2 person shop, how you show up as the leader, whatever that leadership title happens to be, that sets the tone.
Right.
And if you are in an industry or in a company or in a team, a part of a team that you're not passionate about, that you don't truly believe in and you're not fully engaged with, then it's going to show up in one way or another. It's going to show up.
Yeah.
And we always say in recruiting that, work is hard enough as it is. Don't make it harder by doing something that you don't even enjoy.
Right.
At least enjoy what you're doing so that it makes the tough days a little bit, easier to swallow.
Right. But you're also touching on the responsibility of the leadership to even give the opportunity for that enjoyment sometimes.
Yes.
And the space to have it. Right. So I'm so interested to hear about, what type of environments are you recruiting for first? Because I feel like it's so diverse, but where are you spending most of the time focusing these days?
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, to my point a minute ago and to your question, I've been able to build my team and my firm and my clientele around what I like doing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of recruiters out there that, come from a larger firm as I did, and they hang out their own shingle, and they are all about recruiting, and they don't like the business development side. Many of them don't even like the management, or the operations side.
Yeah.
For me, I actually love managing a team. I like the business development side. And while I enjoy the actual, kind of nuts and bolts of recruiting, it's not my first love. My first love is more the business development side and the management side. So I've built my company around what I enjoy and where my strengths are. So I do all the BD, I run the business, but I have, several very, very strong, very competent recruiters, and they are in charge of the delivery, if you will, once I bring a client in. So to your question, so we work with primarily, kind of what we call lower to middle market companies, which means revenues of, $15-20 million up to a couple billion. So that's kind of the range of revenue.
Okay.
But 100% of our clients are privately held, most of which are actually either private equity firms or owned by private equity. But the other chunk is actually private companies that are still founder led. So that's really our specialization across a really wide variety of sectors and industry, focus areas, whether it's technology or biotech or retail or food and beverage or manufacturing. It's across a pretty wide spectrum. And then we specialize in the functional side. We do a lot of work in sales and marketing, which is, a lot of fun to recruit those kinds of those leaders. And the other leadership recruiting areas that we work in is accounting and finance, as well as a focus on operations. And then what we call our C-suite, which is president and CEO searches as well.
Right. So, of course, all my bells and whistles are going off because you're saying all the worlds that I am always in. And private equity is one of those spaces that the experiences that people have with private equity varies. And, really, do you find that you have to almost develop relationships with these firms that are a bit more intimate than usual in order to place? Because a lot of times, and I want to say this sensitively, the people that are brought in those types of environments and are placed throughout these interactions, acquisitions, mergers, all these types of things, it could really vary how much of an investment and how much attention and how much support they get, right? So, and I guess that's any situation, but particularly in these with private equity. So do you find that you partner specifically with certain firms, or are you welcoming to all and then figuring it out and how to deal with it as you go?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's it's definitely case by case because there are different types of private equity firms. There's all different types of any kind of ownership group.
Correct. Yeah.
Whether it's an outside private equity firm or whether it's a startup company relying on venture capital, whether it's a family office where it's a wealthy family that invests in businesses.
Right.
So there's a wide range out there. But I think, is a whole other conversation perhaps. But, one of the things that I think a lot of companies are not very good at is really owning and acknowledging and leveraging their employment brand. What I mean is, every company has a brand in terms of whatever their product or service is that's externally focused. But your employment brand is, what kind of a company are you like to work for? Are you a hard driving, 6-7 days a week, working on weekends kind of an organization? Or are you more of a leisure company where you have every other Friday off and it's more easygoing and it's more buttoned up? Are you an earlier stage company that's still trying to figure things out? And so the policies and procedures are not quite all set in stone yet. It's a bit more fluid. Or are you a multi-billion-dollar, very mature company where
maybe
it takes a lot to move the needle? Yeah, exactly. And yeah, exactly. And a lot of companies aren't really good at owning that when it comes to the interviewing and hiring process.
Great point.
Now, private equity, I think, is actually pretty good because everybody knows that for the most part, the goal, right, the game plan with private equity is to buy a company, increase its revenue and also decrease, right, their operating expenses with the goal of selling the business in whatever 3 to 6 years time.
Clear lines.
Yeah, so very clear. No one goes into it thinking, "Oh, I'll be here for 20 years and the company's going to stay, as owned by PE firm ABC." The goal is there, and so you always know what the game plan is going to be. But to your point, different private equity firms have different approaches to doing that. Some are more kind of slash and burn, and they just kind of They're focused
Burn it.
on ridding themselves of any what they see as excess costs, which can unfortunately mean they cut to the bone sometimes, and it winds up being detrimental. Others are focused more on let's find ways to increase the revenue. One of the things that we see a lot, and we do so much in the way of sales and marketing, even the CEO president searches that we do, in most cases we're looking for a president or CEO that came up the sales or marketing route, as opposed to coming up engineering or finance, if you will.
Makes sense.
And because a lot of times a founder-led company, typically a founder is a brilliant specialist in a particular function, engineering, operations, could be science, whatever it might be, and they probably aren't as passionate about or good at the revenue production and marketing side.
Absolutely.
And so when we were brought in and a private equity owned company needs a new leader, then they come to us and say, can we need a new president or CEO, but we want this person to come up the revenue route or the marketing route to be able to really expand, again, the P&L from a revenue side versus just cutting back on the expenses.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, you're so right about the identity of the company and people being forthcoming when they're asking for that kind of integration and support. I see that all the time on my end too, of, needing to go in and saying, who do you think you are? And actually, who does everybody else think you are?
Right.
And where is it aligned? Truth in the middle somewhere, right? So and really figuring that out. But it seems like you've really, you know what questions to ask. And it must be after all these years of experience that you have and really understanding what you're trying to get at. I'm assuming you do it pretty quick.
Thank you. I think we're very quick and very efficient at the discovery side with our kickoff calls and really knowing, to your point, what questions to ask, and not just taking the first answer at face value, but doing what we call is peel back the layers, right? So they give you one answer, then you ask more. Well, tell me more about that, and why is it that way, and what's the difference here? What's missing with your current leadership team? Right. How will hiring this person free you up as the chairman of the board or as the CEO to do what you want to do? So asking those deeper questions really goes a long way. The process, it takes a while, as you might expect. At the level that we work in, leadership recruiting, it's usually around, 2 to 3 months from the day we start to the day the person shows up in the job.
Right.
But that's to make sure that we're not just presenting the first candidate that we happen to find.
Right.
And, and our search, our approaches and our value add is not that we post a job on some job board and hope that somebody decent applies. When we are proactively going after people that are at the top of their game, that don't have the time to pick up their head and look at a job board someplace. But if they get a call from a search firm like ours with a very specialized, relevant, industry specific search, then they'll say, I'll consider that position. So it takes a while to identify and source and then screen through those candidates before we get to presenting what we call our short list of candidates, to our client.
Yeah. And the right assessment up front also leads to that conversation going much more seamlessly, because getting somebody's attention and making sure that they have buy-in, and it has to be fast because people are busy, right? Especially when we're working with the executives. So if you already know that information up front that they want to hear, then, more than likely they're going to move in your direction. So that's, quite an asset, which is awesome.
And well, thank you. Thank you. The messaging is really important. When I first started doing recruiting in the late 90s, as I mentioned, there was no LinkedIn.
Right.
The internet was here, but it wasn't a huge, part of recruiting. I remember that, when we first got the ability to electronically fax resumes to our clients, we were like, oh my God, this is the best thing since sliced bread. It was such a big deal. I didn't have to walk over to a literal fax machine and put it through the system. It felt so great. So, back then, because it was, information obviously was much, much harder to attain, and we didn't have all the connected social media platforms that we have today. So back then, the secret sauce in recruiting was figuring out who to call for a given position, because you didn't really have a place to go to actually, like a LinkedIn, a database of people. So back then it was about, finding people. Fast forward to today in 2025, and it's easier to find out who to go after. But now the secret sauce is the messaging. Right. How do you make sure that your message, when you're reaching out to a president or a head of sales or a CMO, how do you make sure that your messaging breaks through the noise? Because chances are, if that person's a superstar, they're getting contacted by a number of other recruiters and companies as well.
Right.
So you've got to really understand what is compelling and attractive and relevant for that candidate that would help, that would convince them to actually respond to your outreach.
Absolutely. I feel like giving you a hug right now, because because
it's the therapist, it's the therapist in you, right?
Well, I don't know that that's approved in the therapy world, but
Yeah, exactly right.
But it's more of like recognizing, like working with your organization, people like you, which there's not many, to be honest, that can really do this at the highest level in my world, because I'm brought in on the internal side, usually doing the same type of evaluation, but for people on the internal side of things. And the conversations you're having up front are so vital, because I'll be sitting there with people that are like, this is the type of person we need. And it's just a picture of just rainbows and sunshine and all these things. And you're like, this doesn't feel right, and working with people that can really cut to the chase and identify where you're going, what you're actually trying to achieve, what would this person would bring to the table. Everybody thinks they want a mini me sometimes. And it's we don't know that that's the best for the company. So being a person that can have those conversations and challenge the environment in that way before you bring people in, because that's the worst, to lose candidates, that are going to be good fits. And then when somebody's in, even worse off, if we went under this guise of this is what we need, and we just bought into all that, and then we bring somebody in, it's like, here's what you need, and then no fit whatsoever, no way to incorporate or utilize them in the space that they're going to be in, and the impact is minimal, then all of that time and money and energy, and now you have just the shock and awe in the environment and in the culture of the company now of something not being a good fit. I mean, the impact is huge. And, that's why I'm like, yes, this is what people need to know about how these types of things are working sometimes, because they don't know that there's so much nuance to it. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think it's very, very well said. I think, a lot of times the clients that we work with, they have not worked with an outside search firm before. They bring us in for one of three reasons. Either A, is a confidential search and their internal team just can't do it because they need someone on the outside to do it with a very sensitive, touch. Second scenario is they've tried to fill a position on their own, and for whatever reason, they just haven't been able to find the right person. Or the third scenario is it's a high impact role and their internal team doesn't have the bandwidth to do the search and do it the right way. But
and objectively, all three of those, just side note,
and objectively, right? Yeah, you're exactly right. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in all three of those cases, the biggest challenges, to your point, is the company being realistic in terms of the type of person that they're looking for? A great example is that a number of years ago, I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I have this example in my book. We had a client a few years ago that said, Ken, they were trying to hire a new VP of sales. And they said, Ken, and this is the CEO talking, Ken, I want to hire somebody who I can consider my friend. And I said, okay, let's take a step back, right? First of all, that's not a criteria that I can use objectively.
Yeah, it's not going to be on the job post. Friend.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very humorous to think who would say that. But the reality is a lot of people make a hiring decision based on that criteria. It may not be, a conscious decision, but they're saying in their own minds, right, based on first impressions and whoever they get reminded of when they see that person. It's a matter of, can I see myself hanging out with this person after work and having a beer or going to a movie, whatever? That's not why you're hiring them. Right. The question is, can they do the job? First of all, do you know the job that they need to be doing? What's really needed and required to get your business to that next step, the next level? And then secondly, can they do it in the way that your company does it? We hear, you hear all the time companies say, we want to be the next Google. I want to be the next Nordstrom's. I want to be the next Apple. The only companies that are good at being those companies are Google, Nordstrom's, and Apple. Yeah. Right. It might sound great to be those companies, but that's not for everybody. And you can't try to be a Me Too kind of a follow on and just become another one of them. You've got to, again, back to my employment brand comment, you've got to figure out what is your employment brand going to be, own that, and then build your team around that. And in many cases, our client will come to us and they're convinced in the beginning that they have to find somebody from their industry. The phrase I always hear is, nobody can possibly understand what we do other than someone that comes from my industry. And certainly in some cases that's true. In most cases, it's not, honestly. Right. And so we'll say, well, let's talk about the makeup of your team already. How many people on your team already come from the industry? Yeah. And most of the time, it's a lot of people. Right. And so we say, well, if you truly want to be disruptive and innovate the way that you've told us you do, then you've got to bring somebody in with a different perspective that starts from a different place. Yes. That diversity of, I call it diversity of thought. Yeah. You've got to have people thinking differently in a more diverse fashion.
Absolutely. More of an asset.
Otherwise, you're going to just create an echo chamber, and that will not move the needle long term.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's essential.
Yeah.
I think, the evolution of the safety of where things are and the risk and kind of the lack of control over where things are going to go, that people want to latch so hard on and keep themselves kind of feeling safe in these types of spaces instead of taking those risks of making an environment that is just more filled with input that comes from different places and different perspectives. It's so essential. And it's really where the assets are in these situations. But I'm so intrigued. First of all, I don't know. I'm like, should I go in before he gets there and try to clean up things so when we bring him on board, he gets what he wants and then I'll clean up after? Or like, like how do we prepare the best space for you to come on board? But it sounds like, you also integrate well into the companies you work with.
We really do. And that's one of the big differentiators for us also is that I think because I grew up in a household where, I had two, parents that were self-employed, I really gravitate towards that, working with founders, working with leaders that are a little bit more hands-on. And so there's a phrase in recruiting that says, we're not an order taker, right? We are a partner. Right. And that really defines it very well. So in other words, if you go to the grocery store, right, you're writing a list of things and you're just going to execute that list. Right. Find this, and this, right? And you may not find all those things, but that's your goal. As opposed to having a conversation about, okay, why do we need this? Do we really need this? We have something else already at home that will take the place of that item, kind of a thing. Right. And so we see ourselves literally as an extension of our client, representing them in the marketplace. And so we'll tell them that, we are going to give you candid feedback, to your point earlier, right? About here's how you think you are perceived, and here's the reality of how you actually are perceived. And hopefully those things are aligned. Sometimes they're not. And so we tell our client that we are going to be very candid and very transparent, where we over communicate. And if they're not okay with that, then we're probably not the right fit for them. Right. But the goal ultimately is to help them be more successful by bringing them the right kind of talent that we see them needing based on our 28 years of experience doing this and seeing this happen and play out time and time again. So and there are times, to your question, there are times where I'll come into an organization and we're not doing a search just yet, but we'll be kind of a sounding board. They'll say, hey, Ken, I'm not ready to go out to search yet, but here's what we're thinking about doing. Right. What do you think about this? Yeah. In terms of, we call that talent mapping. What does the landscape look like for this kind of a hire? I love that. Where will I pull somebody from? How many of our competitors are actually doing the same search? What's the compensation level that I should be budgeting for this position when I do open it up? Right. So having those kind of preliminary conversations is something that we also offer to our clients. Yeah, I love that. You're such an integral part of the succession planning, if there was planning. You're still a part of the process. Exactly. But so when I say succession, what is your instinctual response when you first think about it? That very few companies have one. Yeah. It's interesting. It's I was at a meeting this morning that I was running, and we were talking about succession planning, and we were talking about how it is with a lot of founder-led businesses, and we joked that the succession plan is please don't die. Right. Because if the leader gets hit by a bus, God forbid, true. Yes. Yeah. Then there's no succession plan. They haven't thought about, okay, do we have somebody internally that can move up if that happened? And are we grooming somebody to support them in their own career journey where 2 or 3 years down the road, they'll be ready to move up? Or will we probably need to go to the outside just based on the nuances of our business? And it's really hard to do. Look at companies like Disney. You would think that Disney would have gotten it right with their succession plan when Bob Iger first left and Bob Chapek came in. And with that amazing board and the brilliance of that company and the multi-billion dollars in revenue, you would think they would get it right. But, even they failed, right? There's no other way to say it. They failed. And so Iger had to come back. So it is no easy task, even when you do have an abundance of resources at your disposal. But to do nothing and ignore it, especially in this day and age where so many companies are aging out in terms of their leaders, there's got to be somebody, behind, kind of coming up in the ranks to succeed them. Right. And the worst time to look for, a new president, CEO is when you're forced to. Yeah. When you're forced to because something terrible happens, right? Yes. So finding a way to have a proactive approach creating kind of, we call it a bench of talent, people that you're talking to in the industry where you're not saying, hey, I want to hire you tomorrow, but you're just opening up a dialogue to get to know them. They get to know you. So when you do start that search, you have a starting point, a jumping off point of people to start talking to and have that dialogue.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the thing that I always come back to, especially talking with people and all the professionals in this podcast. Do not avoid succession planning. You are never too small to start succession planning. Like, there is a natural just discomfort with the thought.
There is.
And it's a very human response. But when we talk about it strategically, it makes so much sense. And how you build upon, especially in the early stages, and when we work with startups and, you know, founders in the startup environment, it's a part of the culture that you can infuse that gives people structure and security and says, you know, we got you. You know, we're always thinking about what could be, and we're going to make sure that everybody has the guardrails in place, even if things start to go sideways. We're not promising perfection. We're not promising that, you know, everything's going to be seamless and there's never going to be a problem. But we're saying, like, if there is, we know how to be resilient, and why not build that in from the beginning? And that's what needs to be done, in my opinion. And that sounds like you're of the same mind.
I agree completely. Yeah, it's very well put. And I think, you know, people say, well, you know, how do we even start that? And I have so many things to worry about. I'm a 5, 10, whatever, 50 employee company. I don't know how I would carve out time to think about succession planning. One of the things I always talk about is, you know, start with developing an advisory board. You don't need to have a full-blown corporate board.
Call us. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. I mean, the whole reason why it's called an advisory board, because they're advising.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Exactly.
Right. It's obviously different than a public company corporate board like Disney, as I was talking about.
Sure.
But an advisory board is somebody from outside your company, ideally even outside your industry, that's going to be objective and going to say, are you thinking about these things, Mr. and Mrs. CEO founder?
Right.
Have you thought about what you're going to do if something happens, or what you want to do with your legacy? Is there somebody in your family that wants to take over eventually, or maybe there's not? But starting with even a small 3 to 4 person advisory board is a great way to start at having those objective conversations. But you've got to be willing to hear the feedback, and not just create yet another echo chamber, but really be willing to have people tell you, okay, you know what, you're not thinking about this. This is a blind spot. Yeah. And if you don't address it now, you're going to be forced into addressing it in a time where it's very uncomfortable. Right. So an advisory board is really helpful. I love that. I'm part of an organization, so I run the San Diego chapter within the Southern California region of a group called PDA, which is the Private Directors Association. It's a national organization based out of Chicago. It's a great group, but it's focused around, you know, board governance and board creation for privately held companies, many of which are founder-led or private equity owned, as I talked about earlier. And it's a great way to figure out, okay, so how do I start? Where do I start from? Right. And there are people like me that sit on advisory boards and on, you know, formal corporate boards as well, that want to help, that want to bring a new lens, a new perspective to that organization to help them get to the next level or next, you know, point in their journey, but also to help them identify and uncover and hopefully fill those blind spots so that they're operating in a more effective manner. Yeah, I know. I love that. I love that support, you know, great group. And even talking about the advisory piece, I feel like I need to say for people listening, if you have an advisory board that you're very comfortable with, you don't have an advisory board. Like, you have friends. Right. You have a group of friends. Exactly. I love that. And, you know, so I think that's what it is, like stepping into the tension of it, stepping into the challenge of it, knowing that it's going to push you a little bit or a lot of it into uncomfortable spaces is the point. Yeah. You know, and really thinking through things. It doesn't mean you don't come back to the place where you were set to begin with. Like if you had a plan and then you ran it by a bunch of people, they challenged you in a bunch of ways and you were still like, I still think that's the right move to make, then cool. Like you just vetted that well. That's a good thing to do. Exactly. But, you know, just having everybody go, yeah, you're great idea. Everybody's, we all agree with you all the time. Like that's a red flag. That's a problem. Right. Those are people to hang out with after work, having a beer or whatever. Yes, exactly. They're not making you better, but they're making you comfortable. That's the difference. Yeah, I have a chapter in my book again about that, about the importance of networking. It's called The Practical Optimist,
Okay.
and I wrote it in January of 23, so it's just now 2 years old.
Okay.
But yeah, it's all about being a small company entrepreneur and growing a team, but the importance of that diversity of thought that we talked about having a network of advisors, if you will, to go to for questions and ideas. Also, things that you got, being willing to be vulnerable as an owner, as a leader, those kinds of things. But when I talk in the book about the need to network and build that group, I go through a lot of examples of my own personal examples. But I started my company in 2007. We were doing work only in San Diego, Southern California as a region, mainly accounting and finance, and it was what was called contingent work, which means I didn't get paid anything until we actually placed somebody in a job. But from cash flow perspective, and also was just hyper competitive, I wanted to rebrand and change. And so I fortunately had kind of a quasi advisory board of peers that I went out to, and I said, I'm thinking about rebranding. What do you think? I wanted to move away from accounting and finance over to sales and marketing, because at the time there were very few recruiters out there offering that, and I wanted to differentiate. And I wanted to be able to smooth out my cash flow. So moving from contingent to at least having a small amount of the fee paid up front. So I had some more predictable revenue streams, if you will. And to your point from a minute ago, Kori, there are some people in my advisory, world that said, good idea, Ken, let's go with the blue ocean strategy, that phrase from that book also. And others said, yeah, you're going to be really hard pressed to make that work. You should stick with where you are and stick with, what people already know you for. And I took all that guidance, all the input, and I still decided to move forward and rebrand. But I did it, to your point, I did it in a more informed fashion. I wasn't just flying blind or saying, hey, let's try this and see what happens. But I felt like I was better equipped to make that decision. And it ended up being a very good decision, and it really catapulted us to the next level in our growth.
That's great.
But I'm glad that I had spent the time before then to build that advisory board, to have people that I could reach out to and just get their raw feedback.
I think that's such an asset at any stage. I have people that are just starting their companies and very green in that environment, but they're starting to build those kind of advisory boards early. It might not be many people, but it is helpful. And as you're building, there might be people that just don't match, that you have to reconfigure your advisory board. So it's, it's a work in progress like everything else. So I think this is all really good information. I think, is there anything else that we haven't tapped into? I mean, you have your own personal experiences with succession. How has that informed you and what you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so as my company we've been as big as 7, as small as just 2. So we've never really been a big firm per se, but big enough where I have other people to think about, right? And make payroll for and figure out what the next step's going to be. And and to your point earlier, it's important that it's important that leaders think about the future, but also that they're willing to change. Right? I think that the market changes just over the 18 years since I started the company. The market, the tools, the way that people recruit, what kind of talent that people are looking for, working from home versus working remote. Versus working in the office. Getting talent from all around the globe. All those things have changed, and if I didn't change along with that and adapt, then I would have been dead in the water, a decade ago.
Great point.
So the same thing goes, I think, for founders of companies of any size. You've got to adjust, and you've got to be willing to be open and honest with yourself. Am I a good CEO and president of a company fewer than 10 employees? Yes, I'm really good. Would I be a good CEO of a company of 100 or 200 employees? Probably not. It's not my strength. I haven't done that before, right? So same thing is true for other founders. But the person that gets you from point A to point B, C, and D may not be the right person to go from point D and beyond.
Absolutely.
So being open to that. So long way of saying and asking or answering your question. So I've decided that, rather than trying to build a huge company and travel a lot, open other offices, which I could have done, but I would have sacrificed time with my family. I wasn't willing to do that. I'm now in the process and I'm a baseball fan, so I always use baseball metaphors, but we're in probably the 7th inning, right? Of merging with another organization that will help to build a slightly larger team, to help us have a larger presence and a larger footprint also. And that's part of the succession planning. So the goal is within 5 years then to sell the company at a higher clip, a higher revenue stream than we have today, and higher than I could do on my own. So I realize my own limitations as a small business owner, that I can get to where I want to get to longer term if I merge with somebody else, and then we have the double the capacity. So So that's kind of been the result of my kind of looking in the mirror and trying to figure out what's next for me and,
that's great.
and what's right for the rest of my team and my business.
Right. Yeah. Understanding your limitations and knowing that that's an asset. To understand that is where we focus so much in the performance engineering space, of just understanding that we need to know all of those things and highlight all of those things in order to make them an asset to you and not a detriment to you. And then integrate that into the world around you and how it makes sense, not just how you want it to look. And in that, that sounds exactly what you're doing. So I'm so glad to hear it. You know, it's just,
thank you.
What you do, I of course, I love. But I think so many others do.
Our careers go very much hand in hand in terms of our areas of expertise. Yes. Very, very complementary.
Yes, thank goodness, because we could use all the support, I think, out there that we can get. But it's also helpful to know that when people think of recruiting or executive placements and things like that, that there's a lot more to it that they can really sink their teeth into and feel supported by finding the right fit to work with the right people in the right company, which I think you are. So thank you so much for sharing your time and just being here and giving us all this information. That's really going to be helpful.
I appreciate it. Thanks for doing what you're doing as well, both with the podcast and with your clients and all the work that you do. So thank you for letting me be part of that.
Appreciate it. All right. Well, we're going to be in touch.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
And before we go, a big thank you to all our listeners for tuning in today. We hope you found some valuable takeaways to help you with your own leadership journey. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're ready to dive deeper into your own succession strategy, or you want to be a guest on the show, reach out and email us at ask@korigrillo.com. Remember, great legacies are built on smart strategies. Keep leading forward, my friends, and we'll talk soon. Bye.